March 19, 1942, RAF High Wycombe, Operational Analysis Wing. Flight Lieutenant Peter Ashford sat in a windowless office surrounded by the wreckage of failure. Not physical wreckage, but something worse, data. Gun camera footage, pilot debriefing transcripts, loss reports, meteorological records, all documenting the Essen raid of March 8th, where Bomber Command had dispatched 211 aircraft and lost 37 of them before dawn. 17% losses. Unsustainable. Catastrophic. His job was to understand why, to dissect each loss, identify patterns, recommend tactical adjustments that might reduce casualties on the next raid. It was analytical work, bloodless on paper, except that each data point represented 7 men who had climbed into an aircraft and never climbed out. He'd been reviewing the same gun camera footage for 3 hours, a Wellington bomber's final moments, filmed by its own dorsal turret camera before the aircraft went down. Standard footage, darkness, searchlights, flak bursts, then a sudden bright flash as cannon fire ripped through the fuselage. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of the frame, so brief he almost missed it. He rewound the film, played it again, frame by frame. There. The bomber had rolled, not deliberately but from battle damage, and for exactly 1.4 seconds, its dorsal guns had a clear line of fire at the attacking fighter. The gunner hadn't taken the shot. He'd been trained not to. Rolling during combat was considered loss of control, a prelude to catastrophic failure. But what if it wasn't? The Royal Air Force of 1942 operated according to tactical doctrines developed through 2 decades of peacetime theory and 2 years of brutal combat experience. Formation flying provided mutual defense. Level flight during the bomb run maximized accuracy. Evasive maneuvers were prohibited because they broke formation integrity and reduced bombing precision. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were conclusions drawn from thousands of sorties, refined through operational analysis, codified in training manuals, and enforced through the rigid hierarchy of military command. They were also killing crews at an unsustainable rate. The mathematics were stark. German night fighters had developed a hunting methodology that exploited every assumption in RAF doctrine. They stalked bomber formations from behind and below, used darkness and radar to position themselves perfectly, then climbed into a bomber's blind spot and fired upward into fuel tanks and bomb bays. The attack lasted seconds. The bomber's guns, positioned to defend against frontal and beam attacks, trained to maintain steady fire while the aircraft flew straight and level, never had a firing solution. RAF gunners were taught that their job was to provide suppressive fire that discouraged attacks, not to maneuver for optimal firing angles. The aircraft commander maintained course and altitude. The gunner maintained discipline. Everyone followed doctrine, and 17% died. Ashford had joined operational analysis directly from Oxford, where he'd studied mathematics and physics with the abstract enthusiasm of a man who believed problems had solutions if you could just find the right equation. The war had taught him that equations were built on assumptions, and assumptions could be wrong. He pulled the personnel file for the Wellington's crew. All killed on impact, no survivors. The dorsal gunner had been Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, 21 years old, 16 operational missions completed. By all accounts, a disciplined and capable airman who had followed his training exactly, which meant he hadn't taken a shot that might have saved his life because doctrine said not to. Ashford rewound the footage again, watching the moment when battle damage caused the Wellington to roll slightly to port, and the attacking Messerschmitt slid perfectly into the dorsal turret's firing arc for 1.4 seconds. 1.4 seconds. An eternity in combat. Long enough to fire 50 rounds. Long enough to change the geometry from hunter and prey to mutual threat. But Sergeant Whitmore had been trained not to fire during rolls because rolls meant loss of control, and firing while the aircraft was out of control wasted ammunition and revealed position without tactical benefit. Except what if the roll itself was the tactic? The first time Ashford proposed it, Squadron Leader Matthews listened with the patient expression of a man who had heard 300 theories from analysts who had never flown combat missions. "You're suggesting," Matthews said slowly, "that we train bomber crews to intentionally roll during engagement with fighters. Not full rolls. Controlled bank maneuvers, 20 to 30 degrees. Time to bring the dorsal turret onto target when fighters approach from the standard attack vector. Bombers aren't fighters, Ashford. They're heavy aircraft, fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, flown by pilots whose primary job is to maintain steady formation and deliver weapons on target. You're proposing we add aerial maneuvering to their responsibilities. I'm proposing we give them a fighting chance. Matthews pulled out a combat report, one of dozens that accumulated daily. 2 nights ago, over Hamburg, Lancaster caught by a night fighter. Standard approach from 6 o'clock low. Pilot attempted evasive maneuvers. Exactly what you're suggesting. Lost control, collided with the aircraft beside him. Both went down. 14 men dead. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm not talking about desperate evasion. I'm talking about controlled, coordinated movement specifically designed to what? Turn a bomber into something it's not? Matthews leaned forward. These aircraft are built for stability, not maneuverability. Their crews are trained for precision, not aerobatics. Combat is chaotic enough without asking men to perform controlled roles while being shot at. Ashford met his eyes. Sir, I've analyzed 63 night fighter engagements from the past month. In 47 of them, 74%, there was at least one moment where a controlled bank would have given the defensive gunner a firing solution. Most of those moments lasted between 1 and 3 seconds. That's not aerobatics, that's just geometry. Geometry that requires perfect timing, perfect communication between pilot and gunner, and perfect execution while under fire in darkness with flak exploding around you. Yes, sir. Matthews was quiet for a long moment. You know what happens when we introduce new tactical procedures that fail? Men die following orders that were supposed to save them. Men are already dying following orders that can't save them. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decisions that could never be unmade. Write it up, Matthews finally said. Full tactical analysis, training requirements, estimated risk assessment. I'll forward it to group, with my reservations clearly stated. Ashford nodded, already knowing that reservations was how institutions protected themselves when innovation failed, but also knowing that doing nothing had a 100% failure rate. April 1942. Graf Marham, Flight Training Division. The test pilot was Wing Commander James Harrington, a veteran of 127 combat missions who had survived the Battle of Britain and the early disasters of the bombing campaign through a combination of skill, luck, and an absolute refusal to deviate from proven procedures. He listened to Ashford's presentation with increasing skepticism. You want me to roll a fully loaded Wellington during a simulated combat engagement? A controlled bank, sir. 25 to 30 degrees maintained for 2 to 3 seconds, then returned to level flight. To give the dorsal gunner a better firing angle. Yes, sir. Harrington looked at the blackboard where Ashford had drawn firing arcs, approach vectors, and geometric calculations that proved, mathematically, that the maneuver would work. Mathematics don't account for turbulence, battle damage, pilot fatigue, or the simple fact that heavy aircraft don't like being rolled. Sir, I've watched the gun camera footage from 37 aircraft lost last month. In most cases, the defensive guns never had a firing solution because the fighter attacked from an angle the guns couldn't cover. This maneuver creates coverage where none exists. Harrington stood, walked to the window overlooking the airfield where Wellingtons were being prepared for training flights. I've lost friends because pilots tried something creative at the wrong moment. You're asking me to take a maneuver that happens accidentally during loss of control and deliberately teach it as tactical doctrine. I'm asking you to test whether it's possible. And if it's not, if the aircraft stalls, or the pilot loses orientation, or the timing is wrong and the gunner shoots our own tail off, then we know, sir. Then we can stop wondering if there was something we could have done. Harrington was quiet for a long time, watching the ground crews work. Finally, one test flight, simulated engagement, experienced pilot and gunner, full safety protocols. If it works under controlled conditions, we consider operational testing. If it doesn't, this idea dies here. Agreed? Agreed, sir. And Ashford, if this goes wrong, if we lose an aircraft testing your theory, you'll be the one writing letters to families explaining why their sons died for geometry. Ashford felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto his shoulders like physical pressure. I understand, sir. What he didn't say was that he was already writing those letters every day in his mind to the crews who had died because no one had tried something different. The test flight launched at 600 hours on April 23rd, under clear skies and perfect conditions. Everything combat would never be. Ashford watched from the control tower as Wing Commander Harrington put the Wellington through basic maneuvers, feeling out the aircraft's response, establishing baseline handling. Beside him in the dorsal turret, Flight Sergeant Davies manned the guns, camera running ready to document whether theory could survive contact with reality. The simulated fighter was a Spitfire flown by an experienced combat pilot instructed to attack from the classic night fighter approach vector. 6 o'clock low, climbing into the blind spot beneath the tail. "Fighter approaching," came Harrington's voice over the radio. "Simulating standard night fighter run. Initiating defensive bank on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The Wellington rolled, not violently, but with deliberate control, into a 28-degree bank to port. From the tower, Ashford watched the geometry shift. The Spitfire, climbing into what should have been a firing position, suddenly found itself silhouetted against the sky, directly in line with the dorsal turret's arc. "I have firing solution." Davies's voice was sharp with surprise. "Target clear, 3 seconds. 4, 5. Sir, I could have put 50 rounds into him. Rolling level. Control is stable. No loss of lift. No stability issues." The Spitfire pilot's voice came through. "That was unpleasant. I was committed to the attack run and suddenly I'm looking down the barrel of your dorsal guns. In actual combat, I would have broken off or been hit." Harrington brought the Wellington around for another pass, this time with the Spitfire attacking from a different angle. Again the controlled bank. Again the defensive guns found an unexpected firing solution. On the 5th simulation, Harrington deliberately maintained the bank too long, pushing the aircraft toward stall conditions. The Wellington shuddered, lost altitude, but recovered with standard procedures. "Okay," Harrington said after landing, his tone carefully neutral as he climbed out of the aircraft. "It works. Under controlled conditions with an experienced pilot, good visibility, and no combat stress, it works." Ashford felt something release in his chest, not triumph, but the terrible responsibility of being right. "The question," Harrington continued, "is whether it works at night, in weather, with flak bursting around you, when you're exhausted and scared, and your aircraft is already damaged. There's only one way to find out, sir." Harrington looked at him with something between respect and resignation. "God help us all." May 1942. RAF Bomber Command Headquarters, Strategic Planning Division. Air Marshal Harris received the operational test proposal with the expression of a man who had learned that every innovation carried the seeds of disaster. "You want to fundamentally alter bomber defensive doctrine based on analysis of gun camera footage and one successful test flight." Group Captain Williams, commanding officer of operational analysis, laid out the supporting documentation. "Sir, the mathematics are compelling. 74% of successful night fighter attacks occur from vectors where our current defensive guns have no coverage. This maneuver creates coverage by asking exhausted pilots flying damaged aircraft in formation at night to perform controlled aerobatic maneuvers. Not aerobatic, sir. Controlled banks. The test flights demonstrate it's within normal handling parameters. Test flights under ideal conditions. Combat is not ideal conditions." Harris pulled out casualty reports, the endless scroll of names that defined his command. "Last month we lost 163 aircraft. 163. That's 1,141 men. Every tactical innovation I approve carries the risk of adding to that number. Sir, maintaining current doctrine guarantees those numbers continue." Harris stood, walked to the map showing the previous night's raid routes. Red pins marked aircraft lost. There were many red pins. The Americans are joining the bombing campaign. 8th Air Force will be conducting daylight raids with B-17s and B-24s, heavily armed, flying in close formation, expecting their defensive firepower to protect them. Sir, their doctrine is based on the same assumptions ours was in 1940, that mass defensive fire from steady platforms would deter attackers. They'll learn what we learned. Determined fighters don't deter. They adapt. He turned back to Williams. "This maneuver of yours, does it work for B-17s? The principles would be the same, sir. Different aircraft characteristics. But the geometric advantage applies to any bomber engaging fighters from disadvantaged angles." Harris was quiet for a long moment. "Operational testing. 3 squadrons. Experienced crews only. Comprehensive training. Full documentation of results. If it works, we expand implementation and share findings with 8th Air Force. If it fails, if we lose aircraft because pilots lose control attempting this maneuver, we stop immediately." "Understood, sir." "And Williams, make sure your analyst understands something. Innovation in warfare isn't measured by whether it works in theory. It's measured by how many men come home alive. That's the only metric that matters." After Williams left, Harris stood alone in the operations room surrounded by maps and casualty reports, and thought about the terrible responsibility of command, having to choose between doctrine that was failing and innovation that might fail worse. June 1942, RAF Mildenhall Squadron Briefing Room. Squadron leader David Mitchell stood before his assembled crews, 140 men, average age 23, collectively responsible for 20 Lancasters, and explained the new tactical doctrine with the careful precision of a man who knew some of them would die attempting it. The maneuver is called Defensive Coordinated Bank, or DCB in tactical shorthand. It's simple in principle. When your gunner identifies a fighter approaching from the classic low 6 position, the pilot executes a controlled bank to bring the dorsal turret onto target. Bank angle 20 to 30 degrees, maintained for 3 to 5 seconds, then returned to level flight. He paused, watching their faces. Some eager, some skeptical, all young enough to believe they could learn anything. This is not evasive action. This is not aerobatics. This is deliberate, coordinated defensive maneuver that requires perfect communication between pilot and gunner, precise control under stress, and situational awareness while enemy aircraft are shooting at you. A hand went up. Pilot Officer Thompson, 19 years old. 4 operations completed. Sir, what if we're already damaged? What if the aircraft doesn't respond correctly? Then you don't attempt the maneuver. This only works if the aircraft is controllable. If you're already struggling to maintain flight, adding banks will make it worse. Another hand. Flight Sergeant Davies, dorsal gunner, 32 operations, holder of the Distinguished Flying Medal. Sir, how do we avoid shooting our own tail off? Training. The gunner must track the target through the entire maneuver and maintain fire discipline. You're not hosing down the sky. You're taking controlled shots at a specific target in a specific firing window. The questions continued for 20 minutes, each one revealing the gap between theory and practice, between what worked in test flights and what would work while exhausted and terrified. Finally, Mitchell held up a hand. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is another innovation dreamed up by analysts who don't fly, designed to solve problems on paper while creating problems in combat. Maybe you're right, but I've seen the data. 74% of night fighter kills come from angles we can't currently defend. This maneuver creates defense where none exists. He looked at each crew in turn. First operational trial is tomorrow night. Essen. I'll be flying lead aircraft. If it works, I expect you to learn it. If it doesn't work, I expect you to be honest about why. What he didn't say. If it doesn't work, I might not come back to hear your honesty. June 12, 1942. Essen, Germany. First operational trial. The bomber stream crossed into German airspace at 22,000 feet. Navigation lights extinguished, each aircraft a dark shape in darker sky. Mitchell flew in the lead Lancaster, every sense heightened, waiting for the inevitable moment when night fighters would appear. The intercom crackled. Dorsal gunner to pilot. Contact. Single aircraft. 7 o'clock low. Range 1,000 yards closing. Mitchell's hands tightened on the controls. Understood. Prepare for DCB on my mark. Confirm ready. Ready, skipper. The fighter, a Bf-110 painted night black, almost invisible, stalked them with the patient confidence of a predator that had never encountered effective defense from this angle. It climbed steadily, positioning itself beneath the Lancaster's tail, where generations of tactical doctrine said no guns could reach. 800 yards. 600. He's committed to the run. Execute DCB. Mark. Mitchell rolled the Lancaster into a 25-degree bank to starboard. Not a desperate evasion, but a calculated movement. Smooth and controlled. The bomber's attitude shifted. The stars wheeled. And the dorsal turret, elevated and tracking, suddenly had a clear line of fire. Davies fired. Tracer rounds arced across the darkness. A 3-second burst that walked across the night fighter's wing route. The Messerschmitt broke hard left, abandoning its attack, trailing smoke that glowed orange in the moonlight. Hit. Probable damage. He's breaking off. Mitchell rolled level, checking instruments, feeling the Lancaster respond normally. No loss of control. No stability issues. Just a bomber that had turned the tables on a hunter that expected easy prey. All aircraft, this is lead. Mitchell transmitted. DCB is effective. Repeat. DCB is effective. All crews are cleared to employ if engaged. Across the bomber stream, the word spread. Pilots and gunners who had trained the maneuver but doubted it would work suddenly understood. This wasn't theory anymore. The raid on Essen cost Bomber Command 9 aircraft, a loss rate of 4.2%, the lowest for a German target in months. In the debriefing room at dawn, Mitchell found Ashford reviewing preliminary reports. "It works," Mitchell said simply, "but we need more training. Some crews executed it perfectly. Others hesitated, worried about losing control. The Germans will adapt, and they always do. We need to be better before they figure out the counter." Ashford nodded, exhausted and exhilarated. "How long do you think we have? Until they adapt? 3 months? Maybe 4? Until they develop a counter tactic? 6 months if we're lucky. Then we have 6 months to make this standard doctrine for every bomber crew in the RAF." August 1942. RAF Duxford, Joint Anglo-American Training Exercise. The American officers arrived with the confidence of men who commanded the most heavily armed bombers ever built. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber machine guns and was designed for daylight precision bombing in close formation. Its defensive firepower theoretically sufficient to deter any fighter attack. Colonel Bradley Harrison, commanding officer of the 306th Bombardment Group, listened to Mitchell's presentation on defensive coordinated banking with polite skepticism. "With respect, squadron leader, our doctrine is fundamentally different. We fly in combat box formations, multiple aircraft providing interlocking fields of fire. A B-17 under fighter attack doesn't maneuver. It maintains position and relies on concentrated defensive fire from the formation." Mitchell pulled out casualty reports. "Sir, we thought the same thing in 1940. That formation discipline and massed firepower would be sufficient. German fighters adapted. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the gaps in our defensive coverage. The B-17 has no gaps. Every approach angle is covered by multiple gun positions, except directly below, during the vulnerable moment when your bomb bay doors are open." Harrison paused. "Our ball turret covers the ventral approach. Does it have coverage during the bomb run when the bombardier needs visual confirmation and the bay doors create turbulence?" The question hung in the air, and Mitchell saw recognition dawn in Harrison's eyes. The recognition that every defensive doctrine has assumptions, and assumptions become vulnerabilities when the enemy learns to exploit them. "Show me," Harrison said quietly. The demonstration flight launched an hour later, a B-17 flying simulated combat patterns while RAF Spitfires played the role of attacking fighters. Again and again, the Spitfires found approach angles where the fortress's massive defensive armament couldn't effectively engage. Brief windows, 2 or 3 seconds, but in combat that was enough. Then Mitchell demonstrated the DCB maneuver with a Lancaster, showing how controlled banking created firing solutions that shouldn't exist according to conventional doctrine. Harrison watched in silence, then said something that would echo through Anglo-American tactical cooperation for the rest of the war. "We need to learn from your mistakes before they become ours." Within a week, B-17 crews were training in defensive coordinated banking. Within a month, modified doctrine had been distributed to every 8th Air Force squadron. The geometry of survival didn't respect national boundaries. Neither did the mathematics of death, and both sides were learning that pride was more expensive than adaptation. October 1942, Bletchley Park, Intelligence Analysis. The decoded Enigma intercepts arrived with ultra classification, information so sensitive that only a handful of officers could access it. Among them was Ashford, now promoted to squadron leader and attached to strategic intelligence. The German high command was concerned. Not panicking, the Luftwaffe was still a formidable force, but the tone of their communications had shifted from confident to analytical. Night fighter units were reporting increased difficulty maintaining kill rates. RAF bombers were exhibiting unexpected defensive capabilities. Tactics that had been reliable were becoming risky. One intercepted communication from a German night fighter wing commander was particularly revealing. Enemy bombers demonstrating coordinated defensive maneuvers during engagement. Previous approach vectors no longer reliably safe. Recommend revised tactical doctrine prioritizing standoff attacks and reduced close engagement. The intelligence officer presenting the briefing looked exhausted. They're adapting, not abandoning night fighting but becoming more cautious. Our loss rates have dropped from 15% to 9% over the past 4 months. That's not just the DCB maneuver. It's also improved radar, better fighter cover, electronic countermeasures. But the Germans are specifically noting changes in bomber defensive behavior. Ashford studied the intercepts, seeing the second and third order effects. German training programs being modified, tactical manuals being rewritten, night fighter pilots being instructed to exercise greater caution. There's more. The intelligence officer continued. We've identified increased German interest in heavy fighters with standoff weapons, aircraft that can attack from beyond effective defensive gun range. They're developing air-to-air rockets, improved cannons trying to negate the advantage of close-in defensive maneuvers, which means the DCB maneuver has a limited operational lifespan. Every tactical advantage does. The Germans will develop counters. We'll develop counter-counters. It's an innovation race, and the side that stops innovating loses. Ashford felt the weight of that truth. The maneuver he'd discovered, accidentally, while studying a failed mission, had saved hundreds, possibly thousands of lives. But it wasn't a permanent solution. There were no permanent solutions. How long do we have, he asked, before they fully adapt? 6 months, maybe a year. But by then, hopefully we'll have developed something else. Ashford nodded slowly, understanding that warfare was an endless cycle of innovation and adaptation, advantage and counter-advantage, and the only unforgivable sin was complacency. Then we need to keep innovating, he said, because the moment we think we've solved the problem is the moment we've already lost. February 15th, 1943, Berlin, Germany, deep penetration raid. Flight Lieutenant Sarah Bridgewater had completed 37 operations, 3 more than the required tour, and had volunteered for this mission because someone needed to demonstrate that the DCB maneuver could save lives even against the most intense opposition. Her Lancaster Defiant Spirit crossed into German airspace with 462 other bombers, the largest raid yet attempted against the Reich capital. The night was clear, the moon bright, perfect conditions for fighters to hunt. Multiple contacts, her dorsal gunner reported. Night fighters vectoring in on the stream. Estimate 6 to 8 aircraft within visual range. The first fighter made its approach exactly as predicted, climbing from behind and below, positioning itself in what had historically been an undefendable zone. Bridgewater waited until her gunner confirmed target acquisition, then executed the DCB maneuver with the precision of dozens of training flights. The Lancaster banked. The dorsal turret fired. The fighter broke away, damaged or cautious, unwilling to press an attack that was no longer free. But there were more fighters. A second Messerschmitt approached from a different angle, and Bridgewater rolled to counter, giving her ventral gunner a firing solution. A third fighter dove from above, and she returned to level flight, letting her tail gunner engage. For 7 minutes, an eternity in combat, Defiant Spirit was under continuous attack. Bridgewater flew the aircraft through a series of coordinated banks, each one timed to give her gunners optimal firing positions, each one requiring perfect communication and control, while flak burst around them, and other bombers burned in the night. Then the fighters withdrew. Not because Defiant Spirit had destroyed them, she hadn't, but because the cost-benefit calculation had changed. Attacking this bomber was no longer a guaranteed kill. It was a fight, and fights consumed fuel and ammunition and carried risks. The raid on Berlin cost Bomber Command 43 aircraft, a loss rate of 9.3%. Tragic by any peacetime standard, but the lowest for a Berlin raid in the entire war. Defiant Spirit landed at 4:27 hours, its fuselage stitched with bullet holes, 1 engine smoking, but all 7 crew members alive. In the debriefing room, Bridgewater filled out her combat report with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. How many fighters engaged you? The intelligence officer asked. 5 separate contacts, sir, multiple approach vectors. How many kills? None confirmed, sir. 2 probable damage, but they broke off. Every time we gave them a firing solution, they broke off. Mission accomplished, she thought. Not because we killed them, but because we made them decide we weren't worth dying for. May 1943. RAF High Wycombe, Post-Operation Analysis Review. The conference room held senior commanders from RAF Bomber Command, USAF 8th Air Force, and the Joint Intelligence Committee. On the wall, graphs tracked loss rates from 1940 to present. The curve had unmistakably bent. Air Marshal Harris stood before the assembled officers and spoke with the measured precision of a man who understood that every statistic represented human lives. Defensive coordinated banking, introduced operationally in June 1942, has contributed to a reduction in bomber loss rates from 15% to 9% over an 11-month period. Extrapolated across 167 major operations, this represents approximately 340 aircraft not lost, 2,380 aircrew not killed. He paused, letting the numbers settle. This tactical innovation emerged not from deliberate research, but from accident. From one analyst reviewing gun camera footage and noticing something everyone else had missed. Flight Lieutenant Ashford was studying a failed mission. He wasn't trying to revolutionize air combat doctrine. He was trying to understand why men died. Ashford, present in the room but uncomfortable with recognition, stood when Harris gestured to him. "Sir, with respect, the maneuver itself isn't revolutionary. It's simple geometry. The revolution was in questioning the assumption that bombers should always fly straight and level. We'd built our entire defensive doctrine around stability and formation discipline. We were right to do so. Those principles remain essential, but we'd become so certain that we'd stopped questioning whether there were tactical situations where controlled maneuver might be more effective than rigid stability." Colonel Harrison, the American officer who had initially been skeptical, spoke up. "The larger lesson applies beyond bomber tactics. Every military doctrine is built on assumptions that were valid when the doctrine was created. The enemy adapts, technology changes, tactics evolve. The doctrine that saved lives last year might be killing people this year if we're not willing to question it. Which brings us to the operational question," Harris said. "German night fighters are already adapting. They're developing standoff weapons, revised approach tactics, trying to negate the advantage of the DCB maneuver. What's our counter?" The room erupted in discussion. Proposals for improved radar, long-range fighter escorts, electronic countermeasures, revised formation tactics. The innovation cycle continuing, each side adapting to the other's adaptations in an endless dance of advantage and counter-advantage. Ashford listened and understood. He hadn't ended anything. He'd simply introduced one variable into an equation that would continue evolving until the war ended. But 2,180 people were alive because he'd noticed 1.4 seconds of accidental geometry in gun camera footage. Sometimes accidents mattered more than intentions. August 1943. Imperial War Museum. Tactical Doctrine Archive. The gun camera footage had been declassified for historical preservation. Grainy, scratched film showing the final moments of a Wellington bomber over Germany in March 1942. Most viewers saw chaos. Darkness, tracer fire, searchlights, destruction. Ashford saw 1.4 seconds that changed everything. He'd been invited to provide technical commentary for the museum's exhibit on tactical innovation, and he stood in the screening room watching the footage for what must have been the 1,000th time, still seeing details he'd missed before. A museum curator approached. "Squadron Leader Ashford, may I ask, what made you notice what others didn't?" He considered the question carefully. "I was supposed to be analyzing why we lost aircraft. Everyone else was looking at what went wrong. Pilot error, mechanical failure, overwhelming enemy force. I was looking at what almost went right. The accidental roll. Yes, for 1.4 seconds, purely by chance, that bomber had a defensive advantage. The gunner didn't take it, he wasn't trained to, but the possibility existed. Once I saw that possibility, I couldn't unsee it. And now it's standard doctrine for both RAF and American bomber forces. Now it's doctrine. In 6 months or a year, the Germans will have fully adapted and will need something new. That's the nature of tactical innovation. It's temporary. What matters isn't the specific maneuver. What matters is the willingness to keep questioning, keep adapting, keep looking for the 1.4 seconds of possibility in the chaos." The curator was quiet for a moment. "The official records show the DCB maneuver has saved approximately 2,380 lives through May 1943. Do you think about that? Every day. I also think about the 340 aircraft that were still lost, the crews that followed doctrine perfectly and died anyway. Innovation saves some people. It never saves everyone." "Is that burden difficult to carry?" Ashford looked at the frozen frame on the screen, the moment of accidental geometry that he'd noticed while everyone else was studying failure. "The burden isn't carrying the responsibility for what you discovered," he said quietly. "The burden is knowing that there are probably other 1.4-second moments in the data that we haven't noticed yet, and people are dying because we're not seeing them." He turned away from the screen. "The real question isn't whether we found one answer. The question is, what else are we still missing?" November 1945, Oxford University, Department of Mathematics. Peter Ashford returned to civilian life with a DSO, a promotion to wing commander, and the quiet knowledge that he had accidentally changed aerial warfare by noticing something no one else had seen. The war had ended. The bombers were being scrapped or mothballed. The crews were returning home or buried in foreign soil. The tactical innovations that had seemed so urgent, DCB maneuvers, radar countermeasures, formation tactics were already being studied as history rather than practiced as doctrine. But the lesson remained urgent. He gave his first post-war lecture to a room of mathematics students who had been children when the war started. And he began not with equations but with a question. How many of you believe that expertise makes you better at noticing things? Every hand went up. You're wrong. Expertise makes you better at recognizing patterns you've seen before. It also makes you blind to patterns you haven't been trained to notice. The more certain you are, the less likely you are to see what contradicts your certainty. He showed them the gun camera footage, the 1.4 seconds of accidental geometry. Everyone who watched this footage before me saw a bomber being destroyed. They saw a confirmation of what they already knew. Night fighters attack from below and behind. Bombers can't defend that approach vector. Losses are inevitable. They saw failure. I saw 1.4 seconds of possibility. Not because I was smarter or more observant, but because I was looking for something different. I was looking for what almost worked, not just what went wrong. The lecture hall was silent. This isn't a story about tactical innovation or military history. This is a story about the danger of certainty and the value of accident. The DCB maneuver saved approximately 2,380 lives during 18 months of operations, but it was discovered by accident, by someone studying a failed mission, by noticing something that contradicted established doctrine. He paused, looking at faces too young to remember the war's urgency, but old enough to understand its implications.